insight into the most recent or most important hopes and fears in your societies in terms of what is driving them forward, or on the contrary, what is stopping them from progressing? Dmitry, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Dominika, and I would like to thank all the colleagues who contributed to that survey. And of course, I should mention that the data collection was conducted in so-called pre-COVID period, right? So it was March this year, and some opinions, some attitudes might be not accurate at this stage if you could measure them or remeasure them again. But I still believe that some opinions are very relevant. And as far as Estonia is concerned, I would highlight that at least in March this year, we observed a very high satisfaction of life. So basically, respondents answered the question that they are very satisfied with the life. More than 80% selected that option, and also they were satisfied with the social standing, and they believe that there are still chances to succeed in life, and people in Estonia can be trusted. I think it's a very good basis. Nevertheless, I would also highlight that there are notable differences between different generalized groups within Estonia. And of course, I will come back to that a little bit later, but some vulnerable groups emerged, and those are not, let's say, classical ones as we used to perceive, let's say, Russian-speaking minority here to be vulnerable to different disinformation campaigns, but also a new group emerged from the data. So the people with a lower or without formal education, just an example, or people aged 55 years plus, and people from rural areas of central Estonia. But concerning the fears, well, unfortunately, I would say that many Estonians selected and ranked migrants as the imminent threat to their personal identity and values. So the number of those who selected that option was 56%. And again, it's a very big figure. And that option was the most popular, again, among representative of social groups with the lower education and people from central Estonia, and those who are aged 45 plus, and by gender they were males. So we have kind of this very distinguished group who is by some factors affected and their opinion against migrants. But on the positive side, I would highlight that still the majority of the respondents do not feel to be threatened in terms of personal identity and values by the European Union. So 66% confirmed that they don't see any threat to their identity by the European Union. Or by Western societies and their way of living, or even by the people with other sexual orientations. So I think it's a good stand. But then again, if we dive in and then we see the data, who were those respondents selected these options, so we can see intra-group differences. So basically, young people aged 18 till 34, those people with a university degree, those people from northern Estonia. So these are kind of generalized profile of those who don't see any threat from Western societies, European Union, or minorities. And I would say that we might witness of emerging kind of new divisive lines in Estonian society. And I would speak about it a little bit later after my colleagues will present the situation in Latvia and Lithuania.
Yes, thank you very much, Dmitry. You raised a number of very interesting issues that we would definitely follow up on later. I would like to pass the word to Beāte now.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is a positive aspect that 78% of Latvians are satisfied with their life. However, as a negative aspect is that 36% of Latvians only 36% of Latvians are satisfied how democracy works in our country. But above all, it is a positive note that Latvians do not feel threatened by Western societies and their way of living, European Union in general, as well as United States of America, migrants, and LGBT+. So this is a positive aspect. As well, I think as a positive aspect could be laid out that both Lithuania and Estonia as well as Latvia, we have extremely low percentage of people who believe in conspiracy theories. However, on the ground, we see that, as Dmitry laid out before, that the Russian-speaking minority is extremely fragile to disinformation and as well as conspiracy theories. So this is a discussion that has to be laid out. But on a positive note, I think that Latvia is improving, and I think that these results that was laid out in this research is above all positive.
Thank you very much. Jurgis?
So across all the Baltic states, well, at least Lithuania and Latvia particularly, there was that perception that oligarchs and financial groups have particular sway over decision-making, over the media. For example, in Lithuania, 77% indicated that it was particularly influential around here. So that does not come as too much as a surprise. We've had multiple scandals where the private sector has been involved in a very negative light, and proceedings are still ongoing in that regard. So it truly did not come as much of a surprise there. As far as satisfaction of life goes, 70%, lowest among the Baltic states, true. But at the same time, 70% of Lithuanians being satisfied is not that bad. There are a lot of various aspects that could be lowering this. For example, a different recent survey that we've done, the ESC, found that there is still a fairly sizable percentage of people who have very much nostalgia for the Soviet era, thinking it was better back then. And this could very much have an influence on such results. For this year, I believe this is data from March or May or something like that, right around the beginning of the pandemic. But 21% actually agreed that it was better back in the Soviet times. So that could have a very big role in this aspect. Something that was truly surprising among the results that we found here was the relatively large percentage of people feeling that the Jewish community has excessive influence on global affairs, on the country, etc., with 34% agreeing to this. So that was quite a shock to find that. Of course, there have been difficulties with historical memory, various events that are worthy of discussion, but nevertheless, didn't expect to see it that high a percentage.
Okay, thank you. So Dmitry, you've mentioned the fact that actually I also found very interesting, and it applies for all three Baltic states. There is this extremely low perceptions of seeing migrants and minorities as being favored by others. It's only from 10 to 15%. Just in comparison, in Czech Republic and Slovakia, it is around 40%. Nevertheless, the migrants are seen as a threat to your identity, to your national values. And a very similar pattern was observed in case of the EU, where, as you also mentioned, Baltics do not feel threatened by the EU. They do not feel threatened by the West, which is very positive, or in our view, it's a very positive sign. But then when we ask them about whether they believe Brussels and the EU dictate to them what to do, around 50% says that yes, that Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia doesn't have a chance to influence what is happening at the EU level. So I want to ask you, what is behind this division, this gap? Why are people believing in this, threat narrative? Why do they feel threatened if, as far as we know, the Baltic states are not very much exposed to a flow of migrants, right?
Right, and thank you for your question. I think it's very relevant to my country. Well, I think that what we are dealing with is basically the product of disinformation campaigns launched several years ago, and mostly not by the Kremlin, as we would like to speculate, but mostly by some domestic actors. And if you look at the stories and the reconstructed narratives, well, we see that they are loaded with nonsenses and fakes about migrants, and mostly disseminated through kind of, rumors or partisan fringe media. But nevertheless, those kind of key messages are stuck in people's minds, and so what we measured that those narratives basically reinforced stereotypes and suspicions against migrants and some other minorities, and then consequently increased societal distrust in Estonia. So if we look basically at the different numbers, so we can see that those who kind of feel the fear towards migrants and those who would like to protect, well, basically there is a very strong correlation between those who fear the immigrants and those who would like to trade their values for protection, for a kind of better or stronger protection of so-called traditional values in Estonia. And then if we look at the generalized profile of these people, so we can see again that there are mostly people who have lower education, they are rather dissatisfied with the life, they don't believe in their power to be included into decision-making process in Estonia, so basically they feel being alienated from social political life in Estonia. And actually they would vote on elections rather for representative of conservative party here in Estonia. And actually that was the party who launched disinformation campaigns against well, the European Union in general, but also migrants. So I mean, all these correlations are very much puzzled into one piece, and I think this is very big concern, because now we have another vulnerable group, and then we have to approach them and to explain or re-explain the real threats and to basically debunk all the myths related to the European Union, to the migrants.
Thank you. Jurgis, the similar case applies to Lithuania. Is it also the case that it is domestic actors, as Dmitry mentioned, that are mostly spreading these fears over the threat which is coming from the European Union or migrants? And is there also some specific group of population that is vulnerable?
Now, I wouldn't really say it's a matter of domestic propagation. To some extent, now this is completely my assumption, but I think there might be an aspect of the Soviet rule, of Tsarist Russia even rule, that we've had that aspect of not being in control of our own fate, so to say. And that gives a little bit of an allergic reaction, which is perhaps a little bit xenophobic. This is just purely assumption, of course. Now, in terms of the perception of privilege versus seeing it as a threat, I think that one case that we can look at is the Vilnius area. Now, it used to be very much a trope that the city of Vilnius is very much rich as far as the country goes, while the surroundings, Vilnius region, so to say, is very poor. And Vilnius region is predominantly inhabited by minorities, actually. Well, there's a large minority community, namely Polish in that case. And there was also a Roma community, which lived in abject poverty. This year, actually, one of the slums that had formed was, I wouldn't say demolished, but removed, let's put it that way. And these aspects, the whole perception that, you know, there's these very poor communities which are struggling to integrate, this could show them off as a threat, because as a Vilnius resident, you can ask almost anyone of my age, older really, and they would be familiar with how the, I'm not sure what to call it, because in Lithuanian the term is taboras, but it was a drug smuggling hotspot for the city. It's predominantly known. And that's kind of promoted the sort of threat, you know, the ghettoization, the whole failure to integrate, or failure of the state to integrate the communities could have promoted this sort of narrative. Now, of course, things are getting much better. Things are getting much better now, but it took time, and that could have formed these sort of perceptions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And of course, at the same time, seeing that they are in poverty, it's hard to argue that they're privileged in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Beate, do you see these perceptions in your country evolve over time somehow? Is it also the case for Latvia that the trust in these narratives is somewhat linked to a very country-specific issue? Because also, as one of the attendees, Maria Owen, is asking whether those lower educated people are a group which could be applied to the entire region. So could you please elaborate more on that?
In the case of Latvia, it is similar to Estonia and actually to Lithuania as well. We saw that a lot of populist parties, not only in Latvia, but in all of the countries all across the European Union, used migration as a tool in their pre-election campaigns to spread this information about this fake that migrants are coming in, they are taking your jobs, and etc., etc. So I think that from the other side, we see that these are not only uneducated people who believe in these narratives. We see that, like Jurgis already said, that people who are elderly, who gone through the times of Soviet Union, may look at the immigration as a threat just because their historic memory tells them to look at this so-called problem this way. But if we see in general, then I do think that media somehow is actually responsible about how these stories of migrants are presented to the society. And I think this has to be a discussion with media and law enforcers as well. But I think that in time this will improve, because we see that a lot of the younger generation, they are not looking at this as a problem, but as a everyday reality. So I think this narrative in foreseeable future will change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jurgis, you would like to comment?
In terms of education, as far as Lithuania goes, it's quite curious actually, because it's actually the ones that are a little bit more educated that are more inclined to see migrants as a threat. I'm looking at the data right now that we've got, and actually elementary and informal education or secondary or apprenticeship, that group actually has lesser perception that migrants are a threat. So that's quite curious. Perhaps it plays into the historical aspect that we've been speaking about to some extent. In regard to political parties, now during the 2016 elections, this study landed in a curious period because we're going to have our next elections in a month, less than a month actually now. So, but nevertheless, 2016 elections, there was a political party that really emphasized the whole migrant angle, and it didn't help them at all. It doesn't seem like migrants are that catchy a topic in Lithuania, at least, even if it is seen as a threat. I'm not sure to what extent, perhaps, that concern exists, how acute that worry about them is.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps if we had a question to compare the level of threat between, I don't know, corruption, oligarchy, etc., it would be somewhere lower on the ladder.
I've actually had the opportunity to do a few interviews with migration officials in Lithuania, and they pointed out that it's a bit of a trope, once again, that Lithuanians are very xenophobic, and it's actually better than you might expect in terms of reception of minorities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. So I'd like to turn now to more on the topic of democracy. And I found few very interesting dichotomies in specific countries. Dmitry, Estonia is also from the entire region of Central and Eastern Europe, meaning post-Soviet, post-communist bloc countries, is one of the best and highest in the rankings in terms of the quality of the system, the satisfaction with democracy, the support for liberal democracy, and also the trust in institutions. Nonetheless, and you mentioned this as well within your first remarks, there is a higher willingness to trade the basics, rights and freedoms for other benefits such as financial situation or security. And there is also a higher sentiment that of Estonia having been always under threat and never being able to control your path. Why do you think this willingness is still there despite quite a successful path Estonia has taken?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I should say that, of course, so first of all, that we would like to leave that past behind us, and Estonians very dislike being named as, post-Soviet country, because there's a general perceptions that we are a Nordic country. But if you look at the numbers, I think we have very big challenges to become a real Nordic country. Well, the numbers show that almost half of Estonians are not satisfied how democracy works here. And of course, I wouldn't speculate with that number, is it big or low, because it is in our nature to complain about everything, starting with the weather and finishing with democracy. But the thing is that actually half of these dissatisfied people wouldn't participate in upcoming elections. So I think it's kind of interesting figure that, they are not satisfied and they wouldn't actually participate in upcoming election to change something. And this is, again, very strong link with the alienation of some societal group from social political life here. And if they feel, and it is kind of perception in your head, in your mind, if they feel not to be included, then they alienate more and more, and then you basically one day you have this very polarized and atomized society. Another number I'm very concerned about is that 72% of respondents expressed they distrust all political parties here. I mean, any political party. Can you imagine, like 72%? I think it's very big number. And then, of course, this anti-rating followed by the government, 52%, and mainstream media, 47%. So, yeah, that is something we should look at. And now concerning the willingness to trade some rights and freedoms. And of course, this is kind of very hypothetical question. But again, I think such questions can raise socially important issues. So basically, they can hint about some polarizing problems within our society. And for me, it's a big concern why, let's say, almost a half, so basically 48% would trade their freedoms. I mean, like freedom to travel, freedom to associate, free speech. So they would agree to trade the freedoms for a greater security in Estonia. And of course, I know that our global security is a very sacral topic here, being in a very turbulent geopolitical situation, and which is determined very much by the geography and unpredictability of Russia. But still, almost half of the population would agree to trade freedoms for a greater security. 46% would agree to trade their freedoms and rights for a better financial situation. And the same amount actually would not. So this is, I think, a very interesting situation. We have this polarized, so half of the population would basically agree to sell their rights and freedom for some money. I don't know, foreign money, dirty money, laundered money through Baltic banks, you might speculate, yeah? And then another half wouldn't. And 42% would trade their freedoms and rights for preservation of Estonia's traditional values. And again, I think it's very slippery way, and we should look deeper to these vulnerable groups who are, on some reasons, convinced that money or traditional values or greater security means more than the human rights and freedoms.
Thank you. So just to summarize, you mentioned some feeling of alienation from the system, as well as some vulnerable group of population who are or at least half of respondents would trade their rights and freedoms for financial situation or security, which is a bit of paradoxical for me, because at the same time, most of the Estonians say they're satisfied with their financial situation. So I would like to come to some solutions to these after I pose questions to Jurgis and Beāte. So Jurgis, if I may, what I found very interesting about Lithuania is that 70%, as you mentioned, of Lithuanians are satisfied with their life, and 43% only are satisfied with their financial situation, which is among the lowest in the region. As well, and the satisfaction with democracy is low as well. But at the same time, this willingness to trade some rights and freedoms is low again. It's lower than in other countries. So why is that? Where do you see this gap?
I mean, the thing is, satisfaction with democracy as a system or satisfaction with the democracy that we have? That's the big question. And of course, as data both in this study and in many previous ones have shown, Lithuanians do not trust their parliament, they do not trust their political parties. Let me see. Yes, 1.2% of Lithuanians completely trust their political party based on this study. Now, this might have changed a little bit given the coronavirus, but it is exceedingly low. The total number of people who trust political parties is about 12% in total. So the thing here is that Lithuanians are probably very happy with democracy as a system as a whole, but the implementation that we've got right now, they're perhaps not too happy with how it's working. And that is probably the main driving force between this sort of incongruity that you're noticing here. As far as satisfaction with financial situation, it's a bit harder to say. Perhaps it's, comparing ourselves to Estonia, as Lithuanians often do, looking at how a smaller country is doing better, there still are, brothers, sisters, etc. This one is a bit harder to explain why it's specifically lower like that. But yeah, as far as democracy goes, I am quite confident that Lithuanians are very fond of having democracy. Just perhaps the expectations are for a little bit better model of it, better functioning of it.
Yes, at the end, your political leadership is showing your support for democracy right now as well. Beāte, what I found very specific for Latvia is that only 16% feel their needs and are taken into account by the system, and a very high percentage feel that oligarchs and financial groups have strong control over the government. Is this a issue, or do you feel this reflects the reality on the ground in Latvia, that people are very much sensitive to some wealth gap or to some financial influences?
I think that when we are speaking about the wealth gap, this is improving because as previously we talked about how many people are satisfied with their life here at Latvia, and we saw that it was 73% of people. So it's quite a high number actually. But if we look at how many people are satisfied that their needs are taken into account by government, it's only 16%, so it's really quite low. If we look at the voter turnout in the elections of parliament and in the elections of city councils, for example, it's really decreasing, and it's really decreasing each year. And this aspect of oligarchy, it comes from the 90s, where we really did have some of the politicians who could be called as oligarchs. And at the moment, we see that some of the populist parties are still using this narrative. And people tend to believe that really our politicians are corrupt. They are involved with some financial groups that are taking over Latvia. When in fact, actually, it's just a way of thinking. And I think it's the same case that Jurgis already talked about in Lithuania, that Latvians are satisfied with democracy, but the form how it is presented, it needs some improvements. And I think that what previous elections showed, in the foreseeable futures, we will have these improvements. And I think the mindset of people will change as well. So I think this narrative of oligarchy is just a matter of time until it will fade away, because at the moment, reality on the ground, there are no such people. It's just in a way how media and populist parties is cultivating this narrative. Of course, the sad part is that people are not voting, and it is really sad. But in a way, in other researches that were found here in Latvia, when voters are asked okay, you are not satisfied with democracy, but what are you doing to improve these processes and how are you taking part in them? There were no answers. Like they are not voting, they are not participating in other activities, but seems that it is easier to say, oh, the government is not doing enough for me. But then the other question is, what are you doing to improve the system? Because democracy is a system where everyone has to be involved in order for it to work.
Thank you. But how would you improve the situation? How would you address this? Because we can see these also in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe.
I think that one way how this can be addressed is more and more young people, new faces in politics. Because in the case of Latvia, this is something that people really want. They are tired of the old parliament deputies that are sitting since 90s. They want some of these new faces. And I think that in some way, when we see that a lot of younger people are coming into politics, the system is changing and these faces are changing as well. And I think in foreseeable future, maybe that will reflect in the increased voter turnout in elections.
Thank you. This is also perhaps on the level of the European Union. We can see that within the members of the European Parliament, we have still more and more of young faces being voted in. Dmitry, you also mentioned some alienation from the system. So what would you propose as some of the measures that could be implemented to get people back on board to participate in the democracy and in the system?
Yes, I would suggest that we should work closely with different opinion leaders for different societal groups. I mean, of course, young people is the most promising generation, and the data support that. So basically, all their indicators suggest that they do support democracy and liberal orientation and so on and so forth. But then again, other societal groups should be taken into account. And obviously, just young people, I mean, they don't seem to be opinion leaders for other generations. So then we have to work with those whose opinions and thoughts are being respected and accepted by other minority groups, or those who are alienated or they are perceived to be alienated. And for that, of course, we need very much fact-based awareness. And, such opinion polls and other researches in sociology help and contribute to kind of greater knowledge and awareness what is actually going on. So I think in case of Estonia, there was a kind of very comfortable group of local Russian speakers who could fit to every problem, basically. That if it's like the Kremlin disinformation influence, then obviously those are the most vulnerable again. And then if it's something wrong with democracy, then of course we always look and maybe even stigmatize those local Russian speakers. And then other vulnerable groups within society being overlooked. And I think that's not the right approach. So again, fact-based awareness, what would help, and then cultivation of critical thinking, but not just in schools. Obviously, schools should do that, and universities. But again, among those with lower education and those elderly people, I think they need critical thinking equally as other groups. And another suggestion would be, of course, naming and defaming the real beneficiaries of these polarizing narratives. Because if you look closely, who would benefit from kind of deepening polarization in Estonia, then we as a civil society should be brave to name these actors, these these parties and these whatever agents of influence, because without naming and defaming them, we will see the same situation in years to come.
Thank you. Jurgis, you mentioned the strong feeling of having oligarch and financial groups influence the government, as well as nostalgia for the Soviet era. How would you address these issues that are very much present and bothering the society, and perhaps influence this capitulation or this resentment towards participating in the system and supporting democracy?
I mean, the very simplest answer is time, because the number of those who view the Soviet Union as better living than nowadays, it's somewhat on a decrease. Over the past 2 years, the decrease halted, but I think it's going to continue as time passes. It's quite likely that this percentage of people who do feel that the Soviet Union was better, they simply lost out because of the transition. It was a tumultuous upheaval, a massive change. So hopefully as our country develops, people will just come to see the light, to put it in joke form, but there's hope, Things are getting better, as they might be a little bit slower than some people might expect, but it is all getting better when it comes down to it. And one can hope that this will translate into less favorable views of the Soviet past, so to say. As far as oligarchy goes, that's going to be a difficult question, because worldwide we see that having large financial resources obviously nets you certain opportunities that perhaps aren't very acceptable. But once again, it's a matter of, I would believe, political culture, a matter of expectations, a matter of standards as to how people behave, how politicians behave, and how people receive certain outcomes. And hopefully, just once again, as we develop our democracies into something more, we will be able to see less and less of that. But sadly, it's not guaranteed, because of course, even well-developed democracies in the West have these sort of issues on occasion. So you can't rule it out.
Definitely, thank you. I'd like to turn to the belief in conspiracies now. And this is symptomatic for all the 3 Baltic countries. You have succeeded in perhaps forming a very strong narrative, which is pro-NATO, pro-West, pro-EU. And eventually, I think this also caused the very low belief in conspiracy theories, which are linked to NATO or to the West as such. Nonetheless, there is this, what we usually call the Queen conspiracy of world affairs being not decided by elected leaders, but by some secret groups who aim to establish a totalitarian world order. This one is usually believed by around 40%. You've already mentioned, we've already talked about having some groups of population agree to some statement just because, you know, they've heard it somewhere, I don't know, in the media or from some political leaders, such as migrants are a threat because, you know, it is being said so. So would you think, Dimitri, would you say that this is also the case for the conspiracy theories? Because it doesn't seem like there is a conspiratorial mindset in the Baltic states, for example, compared to Slovakia or Hungary. There, if we ask different conspiracy theories, and there was a strong belief in a lot of them. So how would you reflect on this?
Yeah, I would say that actually it's a very good result that the tendency to believe in various kind of global conspiracies is quite low in Estonia. So basically, Estonians, they don't believe in global war conspiracies or whatever terrorist attacks by American government in 2001 or some Jewish conspiracies. I mean, all that nonsense. I think we, at least yet, we are quite safe. But we should, I think, test other theories which are quite recent, related, let's say, to COVID. And since the data collection was done in early March, so then obviously the questionnaire didn't include that kind of questions related to COVID or 5G or some other constructed stories and conspiracies or whatever beliefs, unproven myths. So it might be quite kind of quite local or even domestic, basically domestically driven. So we should, I think, repeat that kind of survey next year, and then to include other conspiracies and stories there. But concerning nature, I think for me it was an interesting result that those who believe that nature is unwilling or incapable to defend Estonia, so normally we would think that that percentage, which was 33%, so that percentage would compose of mostly, local Russian speakers who tends to watch the Russian television, and they are kind of brainwashed by nature's threat. But then if you look into the data, and then you basically realize that those who believe that nature is unwilling or incapable to defend Estonia militarily, those people are, again, rather from older generation and rather with lower education, and not surprisingly from northeast Estonia, which is mostly populated by local Russian speakers, but from central Estonia. And then again, I think it's a very important finding we overlooked during previous surveys, which were more focused, of course, on obvious vulnerable group named Russian speakers. But then again, it was generally perceived that all other inhabitants or other citizens in Estonia should perceive nature as something positive. And these results show that this is not the case. So again, I think we should look at the data, and next round to include more kind of region or country related conspiracies already named Corona and 5G. So I think they might be more spread in our countries than this, this global anti-Soros something.
Mm-hmm. So this is a secret call to the National Endowment for Democracy to give us a grant next year as well. Just a follow-up question, Dmitry, but how did you succeed in, not making the typically vulnerable part of the population not vulnerable anymore? How did Estonia succeed in basically, integrating the Russian minority into?
Well, I should be honest, and I should say, of course, that I don't like kind of generalization that obviously not all local Russian speakers in Estonia are fully integrated and their attitudes and opinions basically they're not the same as for ethnic Estonians. But if you look at the tendencies, so the trends, they are more closer to each other. And I think if you would measure the situation right now, that the corona crisis made both linguistic or ethnic communities here much more closer, because the challenges and the threats and the problems, they're very similar. And if you are in the middle of the crisis, it basically doesn't matter which language you speak at home. But the integration is a very long process, and I guess Beāte from Latvia can agree with me that it started right after restoring our independence in 91, and these groups of local Russian speakers were surveyed and researched from different angles, and many integration programs were in place and still are. And I think that the results we are seeing now, these are also the products that were cultivated basically many years ago, maybe 1 decade or 2 decades ago. So basically those people who learned Estonian and who went to Estonian school and then who started to work here in Estonia. So now their children are being asked, and then we see that their opinion are almost absolutely the same as the opinion of Estonian-speaking children. So at this moment is rather no big difference. But again, youth is just one group within our society, and I do appreciate all the efforts targeted on young people. But then, as I said, there are emerging vulnerable groups among elderly people and those with lower education, and not necessarily Russian speakers.
Beāte, would you like to react to this? You also have a large Russian-speaking minority.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that these ratings of belief in conspiracies are really quite low in all of the Baltic states. Yet, I think it is because, as Dimitri said before, they are not so popular here in Latvia. What is more popular and what actually is a threat is these pro-Kremlin narratives that are being spread. Target group is the Russian-speaking minority. Of course, it's at large. We have to look at the sociological data for another minorities, but most popular narratives here in Latvia that are being spread and actually is really dangerous is about Latvia as a failed state with failed economy. Latvia as undemocratic state that oppresses non-citizens and Russian speakers and other minorities as well as Latvia as a Western puppet state, which we actually see in the data where people do believe that we are going into the Brussels dictate. We don't do our own I don't know, we are not sorry, my bad. Just these what I wanted to say is that these pro-Kremlin narratives that are being spread across Latvian media, they are more popular than these global conspiracy theories. And I think that is the reason why this percentage is so low, because as Dimitri said earlier, if we could do another set of questions about COVID-19, we would have some different results. And I think there we could see that, for example, we saw that in Latvia, extremely popular disinformation and conspiracy narrative was that COVID-19 was actually made up in Latvian labs, which is of course completely untrue. And but it still is a narrative, and it's being presented as a true fact. So I think that the overall tendency to not believe in these global conspiracies is a good thing, but then in the end we have these conspiracies on the ground that are so much more dangerous, and I think they are really affecting our democracies and all groups of people, not only Russian speakers.
Thank you. And I would definitely like to come back to it. But Jurgis, also based on our other cooperation, which will be on the monitoring of the elections, which are coming up in Lithuania right now. You mentioned to me that actually in Lithuania you've managed to take down many propaganda accounts on social media and actors which were spreading propaganda. So is this also one of the reasons perhaps why, you know, there is a lower tendency to believe some of these conspiracy theories in Lithuania particularly, because there has been very strong and coordinated efforts by the state to take down these accounts and actors?
Now, I think it was Justinas actually who mentioned that to you, but I'll perhaps look at it less from a social media angle. I've been looking less at social media personally, but looking in terms of television, for example. There have been a number of Russian television channels that have been spreading, well, not exactly truthful information, and they've been banned. Now, there is a debate ongoing on whether this is the right move. Because yes, in the short term, such restrictions might reduce their outreach, their capacity. But at the same time, this is basically akin to, you know, permitting more ruthless acts against terrorists because they don't have any regulations to act based on. We cannot allow ourselves to become like what we are fighting. So it's a really important question to consider how we balance our actions against these sort of disinformation outlets, be they on social media, be they on television, radio, whatever. Because yes, there have been takedowns of such outlets, and it might have positive effects, but at the same time, looking at how Lithuanians view the functioning of our democracy, looking at how there's worries on that, and it's unclear whether that's the best approach.
Okay, thank you. I would like to encourage our attendees to ask questions. Please feel free to ask them in the Q&A or in the chat directly. I will be happy to take them. In the meantime, since we are talking about disinformation and conspiracy theories, could you give us some examples, some best practice examples of how in the Baltic countries, because in the Baltics, you know, for example, compared to some Central and Eastern European countries, there have been also stronger efforts from the state authorities, for example, and there's been, I have a feeling that there's a more coordinated approach towards fighting disinformation and believe in conspiracy theories, as well as fighting hybrid threats, for example. So could you give us some best practices or some examples of how this has been handled or tackled in your countries? Dmitry, please. Dmitry, if I may.
Yeah, I would highlight, of course, the role of civil society and those volunteers who were mobilized to help the government during the last corona crisis here in Estonia this spring. So those people helped the government agencies to monitor social media interactions and to monitor basically media landscape, to spot kind of different types of disinformation, or let's say call for actions. I would just name one, but I think there were others. As you know, the COVID crisis happened at the very time of Russian Orthodox Easter, and obviously there were very strict restrictions about gathering, being it social gathering or whatever, religious meetings. But then some people just spotted that clerics on social media were distributing calls for actions or calls, kind of invitations to go to the churches, which is not the right things to do if you are in the middle of the crisis. And so volunteers from civil society can be more flexible and can help government authorities to counteract different disinformation campaigns, as they have kind of good network, and they can be present in different social media networks. And I think it works until we understand that we have kind of one clear goal, that goal of civil society is the same as the goal of the government, basically to overcome the crisis. But I do hope that the Estonian government, or whatever, any government in the Baltic states or in our countries in Europe, kind of wouldn't abuse that movement of civil society volunteers and wouldn't employ that against some groups within civil society. And I think something similar is happening in Hungary or in Poland, and I really hope that we are not joining that club of countries in terms of tensions between civil society and the government.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience asking what regional comparisons surprised you, what revelations about Central European countries surprised you. Did this change your perception of some countries, and in what ways? Is there someone who would like to answer this question about and provide us more of a regional perspective from Central and Eastern Europe? Lucas, please.
I could point out one thing that I found quite curious. Now, everyone, I would argue, at least in international policy circles, there's plenty of concern over the state of democracy in Poland and Hungary. But at the same time, the study that we had here found that, for example, 66% of respondents in Poland found that having liberal democracy with regular elections, etc., is good, and 81% in Hungary. Now that was very interesting, particularly with Hungary's case, I believe, because I've spoken to some friends who are also, of course, in political science circles in Hungary, and they're not very positive about the state of their democracy. But at the same time, there's such positive sentiment toward it. So that was eye-opening, really.
Thank you. Beate, would you like to react to this? If not, I would be still very interested in hearing some measures that have been implemented in your country as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I was really surprised about the fact that belief in conspiracies in general was really low in the Baltics. And I was surprised that it is quite high in Slovakia. 56% believes in these conspiracies, so that is an interesting fact. But to continue with the question how we are combating disinformation here in Latvia, at the moment we are just in the beginning of a road with government and civil society coordination to fight with this. But a lot of media outlets, as well as we, Center for East European Policy Studies, we are taking these disinformation narratives and we are speaking about them and telling the truth to society. as well as our government is strengthening the information space. Some of the Russian channels that are broadcasting directly from Russia, RT, was banned in Latvia, here in Latvia. So we are taking these steps to inform society that especially these pro-Kremlin narratives, they are not true. We are presenting true facts in order for all groups of people to just start to not only to start to believe in this, but to have this discussion that we have this problem. And I think that the more civil society will feel this as a problem, the easier and the faster we will get to government and talk about some rules, or not rules, but restrictions and some collective approach how we can fight with this. Because the pro-Kremlin narratives here in Latvia, it really is a problem. But I think not in a coordinated way, but we are fighting with this, and I think we have a long way to go. But this is a good approach that is happening today in media.
Thank you. We have more questions coming from the audience. There are two from anonymous attendees, which are quite related. Do you think that there is similar understanding of what is democracy across the region? And can we scale back, or how can we scale back? My question would be, can we even scale back and make sure that people uphold the same democratic values and actually understand what democracy is? I've been talking to some of other experts about this as well, and there is this feeling that Beāte also mentioned. People are dissatisfied with democracy, but when you ask them, so what is it? What does it mean to live in democracy? They're not able to tell. So maybe Dmitry, would you like to react to this?
Well, I think if speaking about the region being the Baltic states, so I think we have very much similar perceptions about democracy across our three countries. And that's because, of course, of historic background and all the developments and basically the way to democracy, well, that was very, very similar in Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. So, but I think you might find some quite remarkable differences if you look at Central Eastern Europe in general. I mean, then of course you have differences how democracy is perceived, let's say in Latvia or Estonia, and then Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria. And for me, of course, it was a surprise that this research included Austria, because if you look at the Austrian numbers and Austria data, then of course it was very much different from other countries. And then you understand, and so people who lived lives in a free world and raised their generations not under occupation, communist or Soviet occupation, these long-term consequences, they do have effect on our societies. But I would say also what surprised me about the data, that assessment of freedom of mainstream media, and our three countries. Well, in Estonia, for me, it's very surprisingly low number that 11% think that our mainstream media is completely free. So 53% think that it's rather free, and 30, so basically 1/3, think that not free at all. And if you compare the numbers with Latvia and Lithuania, I think there's again something to think about.
Thank you. There's a question from Maria Oyen for Jurgis. Since the election is coming up, can you say what of the main topics of the campaign is or are going to be? Are there some polarizing maybe narratives which are trying to shift the election, or some anti-democratic narratives?
Not particularly. I mean, there's the absolutely inescapable coronavirus. Obviously, that will be very predominant because it's been a very big boost for the current government. Its response to the coronavirus has been mostly received well. So it's been very good for them. They've been very focused on indicating that, okay, we've had achievements, we've had low infection rates, et cetera, et cetera. So coronavirus is absolutely inescapable. But at the same time, there's the economic crisis that comes with it. And that is the other angle, that there have been some questioning overall how well they're going to be handling the economic aftermath. And that's probably going to be the other angle that perhaps the opposition comes from, and they might argue that, you know, you've been borrowing a lot, etc. So I think when it comes down to it, it's all about the coronavirus, but then it gets approached from different angles depending on what narrative is being constructed basically. And that would be as brief as I can make it, not to extend myself too much.
Thank you. If you allow just a very quick comparison, it's very interesting to see, you know, the difference between like elections in Slovakia, for example, because we had 2 last year, and it was all about like anti-liberalism, anti-LGBTI, the protection of traditional values. Like this narrative is so strong in our country, and it was full of not only social media but also media, the TV and radio. So yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there are obviously other matters that are being discussed. The LGBT situation, for example, yes, that is also brought up. But how should I put it? It's a question that's being addressed by very specific parties, and not the parties that are in the running to be, you know, the main winners of the elections. Because when it comes down to it, the main competition, the main running in Lithuania is between 3 parties: our conservatives, the farmers, and the social democrats. So they've all got their own individual relationships with various other topics, but when it comes down to it, when we're talking about their main competition, it's all about the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dmitry, you wanted to say something, to react? And I would also like to ask you to then summarize somehow with the concluding remarks, since we're coming to an end of the discussion.
Yeah, my concluding remarks would be very, very short, by highlighting that, highlighting the fact that our societies are quite immune against all the nonsenses. Nevertheless, there are groups who are, let's say, more fragile in terms of this information disorder, and we shouldn't underestimate the effect of conspiracies, especially if they are loaded with kind of, you know, political or ideological content. And I would look not just, you know, at the foreign-led campaigns, let's say the Kremlin or Chinese, but I would also closely look at the domestic actors, and especially if those conspiracies are very local and politically or ideologically motivated, then I think they are more appealing to different societal groups here, and kind of, you know, these techniques are often used for creating fractions and weakening the society. And their basis, and that's the reason why we should research and study them in depth, their basis is our psychology. And as we know that they abuse several cognitive biases in very combined fashion. So that's the reason why we shouldn't overlook these political or ideological conspiracies in our countries.
Thank you. Beate?
Yeah, I would like to say thank you for this project. It was really interesting to see what our society wants to be, what needs to be improved. And we see that what needs to be improved is this trust in government and trust in democracy. So I think this is a reminder that government should have this discussion with the citizens, how to take into consideration their needs. As well, I think that extremely important discussion has to be about conspiracies and their impact on democracy. Because we see that even if in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the tendency to believe in these global conspiracies is somewhat low, that doesn't mean we don't have these disinformation narratives on the ground that is from the Kremlin. So I think that this has to be brought up as a discussion, and this needs to be taken into consideration for lawmakers as well, because this is a problem. And I think that COVID-19 will show us that the faster we react to these disinformation narratives, the more safer for our democracies. Thank you.
Thank you. Jurgis?
When it comes down to it, there's two things to look at. On one hand, I think it's absolutely crucial that we engage with both the people who are affected by these false narratives, but at the same time, we shouldn't forget that there are people out there who could be shifted from believing truthful things. And I'm struggling to put together this argument, sorry. Actually, let's talk together. Point is, as I mentioned before, it's crucial to engage, and at the same time, it is very important that we do not become what we are fighting. So that on one hand, it's important that we don't employ some of the methods used by the propaganda creators in our own response to it. And at the same time, as I mentioned, we should be very cautious when actually looking to block them out completely, because we do not want to become what we are fighting in the end. That would be about it. Thank you.
Thank you. With that being said, I would like to very much thank our panelists for taking time and providing us so much of insight into your societies. I personally have learned a lot. If you're still interested in this research, there is a publication called Voices of Central and Eastern Europe, which provides some comparative perspective into this research, but we're not stopping here. There will also be country reports published for each of the Baltic countries, but also for each of the 10 countries where the opinion polls have been conducted. So if you keep following us, you will receive more information. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Dmitry, Beāte, and Jurgis for your remarks. It was a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to some other discussions.